star athlete embarks on a Caribbean cruise with her family.
I thought, well, that would just be a fantastic trip of a lifetime.
In international waters, she suddenly goes missing from her cabin,
I looked out on the balcony, and Amy wasn't there.
leaving her tight-knit family desperate for answers.
I told him, you can't do this. You can't lower the gangplanks. You got to back the ship off of the dock.
Over the course of 20 years, they've traveled the world to find her.
It was a ghost town. There's nobody anywhere.
Their lives forever changed by her baffling disappearance.
Because it's torturous to think about a million things and just not know.
When somebody takes your daughter, you'll do anything to find your child.
March 1998. The Bradley family, Ron, Iva, Brad, and Amy, enjoy a meal aboard the cruise ship Rhapsody of the Seas. They're sailing the Caribbean together on a week-long family vacation.
We had the opportunity to take our kids and thought that would be a really great time.
We had all the outfits lined up and the dinners, and there was a karaoke bar there, and there was a casino.
The cruise is a great way for the whole family to be together again.
And Amy having graduated from college, and Brad being in college and 23 and 21 years old, I thought, well, that would just be a fantastic trip of a lifetime.
Iva and Ron raised Amy and her younger brother Brad in the idyllic Virginia suburb of Chesterfield, where they always provided a happy and secure environment for their kids.
We were lucky enough to have a large group of kids in the neighborhood. You know, play cops and robbers on your bikes and go hunting for frogs and salamanders down at the creek. I'm gonna sound really country when I do this. A swim team in the neighborhood was a big deal. Amy and I were on that together for years and years.
23-year-old Amy has just moved into her own apartment and has plans to start a new job after the cruise.
She was offered a job with her aunt's husband in the computer business, and she was going to start that when she came back from the trip. So she had a lot of things going for her.
Amy's mother says her daughter has always been driven to succeed.
Amy was the only girl on the boys' basketball team. And she always had a tremendous amount of confidence because we raised her that there really wasn't anything that she couldn't do if she wanted to do it.
Amy's athletic abilities propel her to success in the world beyond her small Virginia town.
After high school, she got a full scholarship to play basketball at Longwood, and we never missed a game, no matter where it was.
She did an amazing job there with everywhere that she went. So she was always extremely competitive in a good way.
Despite being an accomplished swimmer, Amy was a little apprehensive when she heard about the cruise, as she's always been afraid of the open ocean.
Amy hadn't ever been on a cruise, and she wasn't a big fan of big boats and open water and all that kind of stuff. But we talked a lot about it, and I explained to her how much fun I had on the one I had been on previously.
And with a little coaxing from her brother, Amy eventually came around. On March 21st, Rhapsody of the Seas boarded in San Juan, Puerto Rico. The whole family was impressed by the massive size of the ship.
As far as the number of people, probably 2,000 plus on the cruise we were on. So it is a floating city.
The Bradley cabin is situated on the 10th floor deck, with sweeping views of the ocean. The family of four shares the room, bringing them back to the old days before the kids went to live on their own. After 2 days at sea, the Bradleys are in their cabin, getting ready for a formal dinner on board.
We were all getting fancied up for dinner. I had tuxedo, and Amy was in a long black dress.
This portrait, taken by a cruise ship photographer the evening before Amy went missing, captures the special bond between Amy and Brad.
We were all dressed in the tux and the gowns, and I remember Amy coming up to us and had a rose for each one of us, so that was pretty special.
The Bradleys dine alongside other guests, as the cruise liner makes its way from its first stop of Aruba to the island of Curacao.
We're with a large group of people that were, just having a nice conversation and having a good time, eating awesome food, taking pictures with each other. It was exciting.
After dinner, Ron, Iva, Brad, and Amy change into more casual clothes and go to the ship's upper pool deck for a calypso party.
We went up on the top deck, and everybody was having a great time.
And the deck was full of people. The band was playing. It was very festive.
The family dances the evening away, enjoying the warm Caribbean air and the house band, Blue Orchid. Amy befriends some of the ship's crew, and Brad mingles with some of the other passengers. Around 1 a.m., Ron and Iva decide to call it a night.
So they came up to both of us and, told us they loved us and they were going to head to bed.
Amy and her brother Brad follow the rest of the partygoers from the pool deck into the ship's dance club.
I had met a couple of girls and I was kind of hanging out with them. We kind of did our own thing in the disco that night.
This footage, shot by a cruise videographer, contains the last known recorded images of Amy. A few hours later, Brad finally runs out of gas and decides to call it a night.
I went back to the cabin by myself at probably 3:45, and Amy probably came in, 20 or 30 minutes later. When she came back to the room, I was sitting on the balcony, and she came out and joined me.
The Bradley family cabin has its own balcony, looking out onto the moonlit Caribbean Sea.
We sat out there and talked about what we were going to be doing the next day. And I explained to her that I'd never been to Curacao, which is where we were heading next.
Around 4 a.m., Brad tells Amy that he's ready to go to sleep.
She said she didn't want to go into the room. She wanted to stay out where the wind was blowing and stay in the fresh air. So I told her I loved her and went to bed.
Sometime before sunrise, Amy's father, Ron, wakes up and sees Amy still sitting out on the balcony.
And I said, oh good, she's safe, everybody's here. So I just laid back down and shut my eyes. Seemed like just a few minutes, and then something woke me up again, close to 6 o'clock, and I looked out on the balcony and Amy wasn't there.
Her bed is also empty. At first, Ron isn't concerned by Amy's absence. He assumes she's smoking a cigarette on deck or taking photos of the sunrise somewhere else on the ship.
So I said, well, I'm just gonna go up here and see if I can find her. I didn't want to startle Brad or startle Iva, so I just went up and looked for her.
Ron searches all along the outer decks, hallways, and open spaces on the ship. An hour later, he still hasn't found his daughter, and he rushes back to the cabin to tell his wife and son that he can't find Amy.
On the way back, when I finished looking, I was coming back to the room and the head security officer was standing about, 30, 40 feet from my room and told him that Amy was missing. And then I went back to the room.
By the time Ron makes it back to the cabin, he's panic-stricken.
Woke up, he touched my foot at 7 in the morning, and I didn't even recognize him.
I remember waking her up and telling her, I can't find Amy. And her eyes flew open. What do you mean you can't find Amy? I said, I can't find her. She's not in the room.
And so 3 seconds later, I'm up, dressed, and we're running down the hallway. I said, we've got to go to the purser's desk. We've got to get down and let somebody know we can't find her.
It's been 2 hours since 23-year-old Amy Bradley was last seen by her family on a cruise ship off the coast of Curacao. As the ship nears its next stop, the Bradley family searches the decks for Amy, appealing to crew members for help.
It was not normal that she wasn't there or that she left and didn't tell us.
Amy's parents, Ron and Iva, say they tell the ship's captain that they can't find Amy.
We told them that our daughter was missing. Could they please make an announcement or do something to help us find her?
But the Bradleys say he tells them he doesn't want to disturb the other passengers with the news.
At this point, I'm crying and saying, give me a supervisor. I need to speak to somebody.
As the ship nears its scheduled stop, at the island of Curacao, a Dutch territory off the coast of Venezuela, the Bradleys are now desperate with fear. With Amy missing, they don't want anybody leaving the ship.
And that's when I told him, you can't do this. You can't lower the gangplanks. You got to back the ship off of the dock. And so they did none of that.
Cruise company officials later say that they didn't believe foul play was involved in Amy's disappearance. As thousands of passengers disembark to the island, the captain assures the Bradley family he will conduct a thorough search of the entire ship. But several hours later, he returns with bad news.
He had come back in and said that they had searched the ship in its entirety and that Amy wasn't on the ship.
And I think at that time, I kind of blacked out a little bit. And so then he suggested, because she wasn't on the ship, we had one of two choices. We could stay on the ship, or we could disembark on Curacao.
After a 12-hour stopover, the ship prepares to sail on to its next stop at St. Martin. The Bradleys make the agonizing decision to go ashore in Curacao and search for Amy on their own.
When they put us off on the island, we didn't have any instructions. It was like, you're just off the ship. So you had to kind of fend for yourself.
Disoriented, the Bradleys seize on the American embassy as their only hope in an unfamiliar country.
We went over to the embassy, and they were given search grids. They were going to start a search in the ocean.
Investigators can't pinpoint exactly when Amy left the ship, only that it was sometime between early dawn, when Ron saw her on the balcony, and 7 a.m., when she was discovered missing. Thinking she may have jumped or fallen overboard and possibly tried to swim to shore, the local Navy begins their search in the waters surrounding Curaçao's port.
We didn't know where she was. We didn't know where we were. We didn't know what to do.
And I remember walking, looking out and seeing the boats and the helicopters and all the local boats out looking in the water.
After hours searching the ocean off Curacao, the teams find no trace of Amy. Despite the captain's assurance she isn't on board, the Bradleys decide to go back to the ship, now docked in St. Martin, to look for their daughter, this time with the support of the FBI. Cruise company officials fully cooperate with investigators.
We flew from Curacao, and we demanded that we be allowed to reboard.
The FBI came on and they approached us and told us who they were and told us that they would leave no stone unturned to help find Amy.
You interview folks that are last known to have seen that individual or folks that you believe that are involved, and a lot of interviews get conducted.
FBI agents start with the people on board closest to Amy, her family.
And I told my wife at the time that we're suspects just like anybody else would be because we were the last people to see her.
They interviewed Ron, myself, and Brad separately. They had us sketch out the balcony and where the chairs were and where Amy was sitting and all of that.
And then they had interviews during the day of different people that were on the ship.
Special agents talk to as many of the approximately 2,900 passengers and crew as possible. Amy's mother, Iva, recalls several individuals on board who appeared to take a special interest in Amy.
I finally said, there's a bunch of people on here that have been around Amy and interested in Amy, and I need for y'all to talk to them because, in a couple days, this ship's gonna dock and everybody's gonna leave.
Several witnesses recall seeing Amy in the ship's disco.
Folks came forward and accounts and statements were made that she was with several individuals, from people that were crew members to people that were, of course, passengers.
Many sources recall seeing Amy with a man named Alistair Douglas, also known as Yellow.
There was one particular crew member that she was dancing with. He was a member of the band, the Blue Orchid.
2 girls, and they were saying that we saw Amy with Alistair Douglas. We saw her, and she went up an elevator, and he was with her early in the morning.
The witnesses say they recall seeing Amy and Douglas together before dawn, after Brad went to sleep, but the exact time is difficult to verify.
You're vacationing, you're on a cruise, everybody's from all across the country. No one has the proper time. You're in international waters. But we did have folks come forward. People saw her on the deck walking around, going into the elevator. All accounts that we truly believe are genuine.
Brad is haunted by an encounter he had with Douglas just a few hours after Amy went missing.
I'm sitting by the pool at a table, and up walks this guy, Yellow, Alistair Douglas. And the first thing he says is, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear about your sister." And wasn't thinking at the time. I was just kind of overwhelmed with the thoughts I was having, and I was just kind of like, yeah, thanks.
In retrospect, Brad finds the timing of Douglas's expression of sympathy suspicious.
There had been no announcement made. There was no loudspeaker about her disappearance or the fact that she was missing. So, again, looking back, what did he know happened to my sister?
FBI investigators agree that Douglas is somebody they need to talk to right away.
For this particular case, because the individual that was a member of the crew, that was a member of the band that was playing that evening, that Amy saw and was dancing with, was essentially could be the last individual to see her that day.
Douglas agrees to submit to a polygraph exam. Afterwards, Amy's father, Ron, says he's troubled by Douglas's seeming nonchalance.
He came out of the interview smiling with his thumbs up to his band members, like everything's cool. It made me feel like I wanted to strangle him, actually. I knew what was going on. I knew he had been with Amy.
Douglas tells investigators that he knows nothing about Amy's disappearance. After countless hours of interviews at sea, the FBI investigation doesn't produce any other viable leads. They can't even confirm the times that the Bradleys think they last saw Amy in their cabin.
By 4 a.m. to 7 a.m., we have a gap of time that we just don't have the answer to. We don't know what happened.
On March 28th, Ron, Iva, and Brad fly back to Chesterfield without Amy, reeling from their loss.
You have a family that started a week ago in a joyous state, happy to be there, family vacation, to now they have to return back to their home without their daughter.
It was just kind of a surreal trip knowing that we were coming back without Amy.
It's been 1 week since 23-year-old Amy Bradley went missing from a cruise ship crossing the Caribbean Sea. Now back home in Virginia, her parents Ron and Iva do everything in their power to spread the word about her disappearance.
We didn't leave the computer. Stayed on the phone, emails, people calling us.
We did set up a website for Amy. We just knew that we could not put our head down and go to bed because we knew that Amy was counting on us.
At the same time, the FBI deepens its own investigation into the life of Amy Bradley. Special Agent Bradley Bryant spends weeks conducting interviews with people from Amy's life.
I found that Amy was very outgoing, very friendly person. She had an upbeat personality. Pretty much everyone I interviewed said that she had a lot of friends. She's the kind of person who could strike up a conversation with anyone, and often did.
The FBI's research generates no further clues, but indicates that at least one possibility is highly unlikely.
There's all different scenarios, because people, of course, would say, oh, she committed suicide. But when you look through everything and you peel back that onion, and you look at the type of person that Amy was, this isn't an individual that would commit suicide.
She was excited about starting a new job with her uncle's business when she returned from the cruise. She just got a new apartment a couple months earlier. She just got a new dog, I believe, so things were going good in her life.
Someone saw Amy and took Amy from that ship.
To encourage people to come forward with information, the Bradleys appear in the media to publicize their reward of $260,000 for Amy's safe return.
When you offer that amount, you're trying to, of course, glean anything from anybody. Sometimes you get good information and good folks, and sometimes you don't.
Weeks pass, and no one comes forward. The FBI investigation is stalled. In April, a month after she went missing, Amy's father, Ron, and her brother, Brad, ramp up their efforts in the search even more.
Mr. Bradley and the son, Brad, decide to go back down to Curacao to see if they can find any additional leads.
I feel like we had to do something. We just had to go back and look.
We were passing out flyers we had brought down with us about the reward for information leading to where she was or what happened to her.
Ron and Brad talk to dozens of local people and tourists, and their persistence soon pays off with an intriguing tip.
I was approached by an old island guy. He was a taxi driver, and he said, "Are you the father of the girl that's missing?" I said, "Yes, I am."
And he turned to my dad and said, "I want you to know that your daughter did not fall from that ship. She's here on this island, and I hope you can find her." And then we kind of, looked at each other like, oh my God, this is it.
The taxi driver says he actually spoke to Amy face to face.
He says, "Well, I can remember her coming up to my cab and asking me where a phone was."
The taxi driver suggests 3 specific places on the island where he thinks Ron and Brad should search for Amy. The first location they investigate is a resort on the south coast of the island.
It was a big resort right on the beach, and there was about 2 vehicles at the whole resort.
It was a ghost town. I mean, there was nobody anywhere.
So we left there and we went to these other 2 areas and walked around and did whatever we thought we could possibly do.
Ron and Brad hit dead ends at all 3 locations suggested by the taxi driver. The next day, as they are searching other neighborhoods of Curacao, Brad hears something that makes him stop in his tracks.
The turning traffic light changes and these cars are driving by, and I hear, "Brad." It sounded exactly like Amy calling my name. And it seemed as if it came from a car that was passing us.
He said it was just as clear as day.
"I just heard her voice. Amy!"
And he said in his mind it was Amy.
They approach the vehicle, unsure of what might greet them there.
Just a person in a car.
Ron and Brad stay on the island for another 2 days, but uncover no further leads.
I didn't know what else to do, where else to go. So I just told Brad, I just said, we just need to go ahead and go on home.
They head back to Chesterfield, Virginia. While waiting for their connecting flight in the Miami airport, Ron and Brad receive a disturbing phone call from Iva.
She was upset said that they had just called from Curacao and said that they had found a body.
A man who says he's with the island's police force calls Iva with a shocking update in Amy's case.
He informed me that they had found a body and that it was a female and that she had brown hair and that she was about Amy's size, and they believed it was Amy.
I mean, it's not all the time you find bodies in the water, but in the Caribbean, things do happen.
The news is shattering to Iva, Ron, and Brad.
I can remember immediately starting to vomit. Ronnie wasn't there. They were on their way back.
Dutch authorities conduct a series of forensic tests to determine the identity of the body.
They were trying to look to see if that individual was, of course, Amy. And it was not.
It was a partial piece of a spine, and it was found not to be that of a woman.
The Bradleys are relieved. For the next 13 months, Amy Bradley's family and the FBI cope with a flood of other tips, but none turn out to be credible. That all changes in May of 1999, when Amy's case is featured on an episode of America's Most Wanted. A Canadian scuba diver named David Carmichael sees the episode and immediately recalls a young woman he saw on a Curacao beach in August of 1998, 5 months after Amy went missing.
Mr. Carmichael came forward and said that he had seen Amy. He believed it was Amy on the beach area, believed it was her with some individuals.
Carmichael tells the FBI that the woman looked just like Amy. He recalls a specific detail that makes Ron and Iva Bradley believe she might actually be their daughter. Amy has several tattoos, including a very distinctive image on the left side of her back.
She designed her own tattoo for her left shoulder blade, and it is Baby Taz, a Tasmanian devil. That's the tattoo that David pointed out on her left shoulder blade.
After months of false leads, could this finally be the tip they've been waiting for?
Well, maybe that was her. She's still alive. She's here.
"14 months after Amy Bradley disappeared from her cruise ship cabin, a Canadian scuba diver named David Carmichael tells the FBI he saw her in Curacao 5 months after she vanished. Carmichael is so certain it was Amy that he agrees to meet the Bradleys in person.
And that gave us a lot of hope to say, well, she's on the island now. We just gotta find her.
Carmichael recalls seeing a woman matching Amy's description on a Curacao beach. He says the woman had tattoos similar to Amy's, and she was accompanied by 2 aggressive men. FBI investigators say it's the most credible tip they've had since Amy went missing.
At that point in time, what we do, we have our legal attachés down in that region. They work tirelessly to find out if that information could be valid, could it be true.
But there are complications to vetting Carmichael's story. Due to the fact that Curacao is not under American jurisdiction, FBI agents find it difficult to operate on the island.
We are at, I guess you could say, at the mercy of their laws or at the mercy of their police departments. And that right there is a huge challenge for us.
Special agents follow up on the tip, combing the beaches for any signs of Amy or the men David Carmichael reported seeing with her.
Unfortunately, it revealed negative results, and we were not able to corroborate anything.
With another seemingly promising lead hitting a wall, the investigation slows for 3 months, even as FBI agents continue to work with local law enforcement on the island. But then, In August of 1999, 17 months after Amy went missing, the Bradley family gets a phone call from an acquaintance who suggests a radical new approach to finding Amy.
He said he had someone that was Special Forces and that this fellow was interested in helping us find Amy.
The Bradleys contact the private investigator, a man named Frank Jones. He tells them he specializes in cases like Amy's.
He was just telling us that he was instrumental in finding people that were missing. He's very good at what he did.
Jones tells Ron and Iva he has a team he works with to conduct intelligence gathering missions, as well as contacts in Curacao. Within days, he reports back to them a stunning piece of information. Amy is still on the island. She has allegedly been spotted several times on the beach in the company of several men. Jones proposes a mission to see if the rumors are true and asks the Bradleys for more than $24,000 to get his operation off the ground.
He needed money in order to pay his gas and to, the travel and the expenses associated with that.
Tim Buchholz, a former Special Forces agent himself, works as a member of Frank Jones's team.
What we had was a list of hunches and clues and past history on the island, supposedly, and we checked out all the locations that were on those.
Buchholz says his team is told that Amy is being held against her will.
They knew where the house was at with Amy. They knew where the drug dealers that were handling Amy.
She was alive, but she was in captivity.
According to Jones, Amy's captors are local drug runners who are demanding ransom from the Bradleys for her safe return.
When somebody takes your daughter, you'll do anything to find your child.
According to the Bradleys, Jones tells them that he's ready to start planning a rescue operation for Amy, but he needs more money to pay his men. The Bradleys are overwhelmed by the prospect of seeing their long-lost daughter again, but want to be certain that Jones's story is legitimate.
And we said, well, we can't get any more money for you until you provide us some type of proof, pictures, videotape, whatever.
As instructed, Jones sends along photographic evidence. The pictures depict a young woman on the beach in the company of unidentified men, very similar to the circumstances described 3 months earlier by David Carmichael.
The pictures that he provided were a blonde guy and pictures of a girl with a hat, towel thrown over her shoulder, and Amy's tattoos.
The photos are enough to dispel whatever suspicions the Bradleys may have had. Convinced that Jones has actually seen Amy, Iva and Ron wire him $100,000 to fund the operation in Curacao and take it to its conclusion, a mission to rescue Amy Bradley from her captors.
In October of 2000, he tells them he's ready to execute the mission.
He's got coordinates and he's got location.
Jones tells the Bradleys to fly down to Miami and to have a jet standing by to fly to Curacao and extract Amy when he gives them the all clear.
I had her bags packed. I had lined up doctors to see her. I had lined up somebody that could help her, with the mental state.
Ron and Iva fly down to Miami as instructed and anxiously wait in their hotel room, anticipating a call from Frank Jones announcing that he's successfully rescued their daughter.
It was just a sleepless, exciting but terrifying nightmare that any minute we were going to have Amy.
The Bradleys stay by the phone for 1 week.
And then there we sit in this hotel room and no Amy.
Jones finally gets back in touch with very bad news.
He had to abort the mission because some of his men had been injured in a gunfight with Amy's captors.
It is another devastating blow to the Bradleys. But before they can pack up and make their way back to Virginia, Ron and Iva receive a phone call from Jones's team member, Tim Buchholz, that changes everything they thought they knew about Frank Jones.
Little did Frank Jones know that he had invited an individual to come on the search with him that was able to determine very quickly that he was a scam and that he was a fraud.
Nearly 4 years after Amy Bradley vanished, her parents have been funding private investigator Frank Jones's mission to rescue her from captivity in Curacao. But Ron and Iva Bradley are just learning that Jones is a con man, and they have been his victims.
Indeed, he did not know where she was. He did not have Amy under physical surveillance.
Jones's team member, Tim Buchholz, tells Ron and Iva that he was eavesdropping when Jones called them, purportedly while he and his team were staking out the bungalow.
We were at one of the local bars in back one of the hotels, and I'm listening to Frank tell, I think it was Iva, what they were doing and stuff. I think he was telling the family that they had reconnaissance crews out and they were looking at this, looking at that.
Tim told us that wants you to know that Frank Jones is a fraud and he's down here sipping Don Perignon on your nickel.
Ron and Iva alert the FBI, and agents swiftly launch plans to apprehend Jones. The Bradleys are stunned by the audacity of his con operation.
And I'll never understand in a million years, he's a father. How in the world do you tell parents that you know where their child is and you're gonna go get her and it all be a lie?
Jones flees Curacao and flies into Virginia, but he's arrested by FBI agents as soon as he hits the tarmac.
The Richmond Division opened a fraud case in this matter, and over the course of the next year to 18 months, investigated it thoroughly, and we ended up indicting Frank Jones for wire fraud.
Frank Jones later pleads guilty to mail and wire fraud and is sentenced to 5 years in prison. He is ordered to pay back the Bradleys in full. But despite the loss of hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from them, Ron and Iva feel the most precious resource Frank Jones robbed from them isn't money.
He had taken time about away from us being able to really, search for Amy because we put all our eggs in that basket.
The next 3 months pass with no credible sightings of Amy. Then, in May 2002, a former naval officer comes forward with a troubling story. 4 years earlier, when Amy was 23 years old, he had encountered a young woman in a Curacao brothel who he is now convinced was Amy Bradley.
The girl leaned over and said, "My name is Amy Bradley and I need your help."
She didn't tell him why. The former naval officer says he didn't contact authorities at the time because he was afraid he would be punished by the military for being in a brothel.
He was part of the military, and you're not supposed to be, doing those sorts of things at that time. And then when he saw additional things on the news media and realized who he possibly could have seen, that's when he came forward.
The FBI sends local agents to investigate the former officer's story.
And at that time, we did try to exploit that, go down to that brothel.
Agents hope locals can confirm the sightings of Amy, but when they arrive, they hit yet another dead end.
The brothel, actually, at that point in time when the agents were there, it had burned down to the ground.
The former officer's sighting is hopelessly compromised by the passage of time. Still, agents remain undeterred.
You're not getting down there at that time when that person was seen, but at least we're getting information. At least people are calling.
In 2005, 7 years after Amy's disappearance, another alarming tip comes in.
Somebody sent us a photograph of a girl they said they thought was Amy, and she was on a bed, not clothed very well, and it looked very much like Amy.
and it was on an internet site for prostitution down in the Caribbean. There was a female that was pictured as advertising for goods, if you will.
We didn't know where it came from. We didn't know actually when it was taken. We didn't know anything other than we had the picture.
The Bradleys sent it to a person that actually works with the FBI now to do facial, comparison.
And he said in his opinion it was our daughter.
The apparent photographic evidence that their daughter is a victim of sex trafficking sends Ron and Iva into a tailspin.
We did follow that lead. The difficult part is, back then, information such as that or pictures such as that, you cannot tell when they're altered.
Agents on the ground in Curacao have no luck finding the mysterious woman in the photograph. And the FBI can't determine its authenticity, so the lead goes nowhere. Amy Bradley has now been missing for 20 years. She would be 43 years old. Her case remains open, and FBI agents continue to chase down credible leads. Investigators haven't given up on their goal of solving this case and bringing some answers to the Bradley family.
There's still several possibilities out.
On the afternoon of September 13th, 2006, Dawson College was supposed to be exactly what a college campus is meant to be, a place where young people hurried between classrooms with books under their arms, a place where conversations spilled into hallways, a place where students checked their phones between lectures, complained about assignments, made plans for the evening, and thought about everything except the possibility that they might not make it home that day. It was the beginning of another academic year in Montreal. For most of the students inside Dawson, the morning had probably felt ordinary. There were classes to attend, people to meet, deadlines to worry about. Some students were still learning their way around the enormous building. Others knew every shortcut, every staircase, every place to sit between classes. And somewhere among those thousands of ordinary moments was an 18-year-old student named Anastasia D'Souza. She was in her first semester at Dawson, studying social science in the international business profile. She was at an age when the future still seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. There were years of education to come, careers that had not yet begun, friendships that had not yet been made, places she had not yet visited, ordinary days that, until that afternoon, had seemed almost guaranteed. Then, shortly after noon, the ordinary world of Dawson College began to disappear. A man named Kim Veer-Singh Gill arrived at the campus. He was 25 years old. He was armed. And within minutes, a building filled with students became the scene of a violent attack that would leave Montreal stunned and a community permanently changed. The first moments were confusing. At first, there was no reason for everyone inside Dawson to understand what was happening. A sudden disturbance somewhere in a large building does not immediately announce itself as a massacre. People hear something unexpected. They look toward one another. They hesitate. They try to interpret what they're seeing. But then came the realization. Gunfire. And suddenly, the question was no longer what had happened. It was where the gunman was, and where he was going next. Gill had arrived at Dawson, carrying firearms and ammunition. He opened fire near the entrance area before moving into the building. The attack would ultimately last only a matter of minutes. But for the people trapped inside, time would become something entirely different. A hallway could suddenly feel endless. A doorway could become the difference between safety and danger. A classroom could become a hiding place. A familiar staircase could become a route to escape. And people who had been strangers only moments earlier could find themselves pressed together, waiting silently and wondering whether the next sound they heard would be the sound of someone coming to rescue them or the sound of the gunman approaching. Dawson College would later describe what happened that day in stark terms. An armed individual had suddenly transformed a place dedicated to education, friendship, and the future into an arena of terror. But those words, written years later, cannot fully capture what it meant to be inside that building. Because buildings do not experience fear. People do. Students did. Teachers did. Employees did. Parents waiting outside did. Emergency workers arriving at the scene did. And somewhere in the middle of all that confusion was Anastasia D'Souza. She would not leave Dawson alive. Her death would become the center of a tragedy that would eventually be remembered across Canada. But at the beginning of this story, she was not a symbol. She was simply Anastasia, an 18-year-old young woman beginning her first semester. That distinction matters. True crime stories often begin with the person who committed the crime. His name appears in headlines. His photograph spreads across television screens. His history is examined. His words are dissected. Investigators reconstruct his movements. Journalists search through his past for explanations. The killer becomes a subject of endless questions. Why did he do it? When did he decide? What was happening inside his mind? Could anyone have stopped him? What warning signs have been missed? Those questions matter, but they can also create a dangerous imbalance, because the person who carried the weapons is not the only person whose story deserves to be remembered. There were dozens of lives changed inside Dawson that afternoon. Some people walked away physically wounded. Others escaped without visible injuries, but carried memories that would remain with them long after the police tape disappeared. And one family received the kind of news that divides a life into two parts. Before and after. Before September 13th, Anastasia's family knew her as a daughter, a sister, a young woman with plans. After September 13th, the world knew her as the student who died at Dawson. The difference between those two descriptions is enormous. One described a life. The other describes the way that life ended. That is why this story must begin before the gunfire, before the police arrived, before the ambulances, before the headlines, before the word massacre appeared in newspapers across the country. Because tragedy does not begin when the first shot is fired. For the people who survive it, tragedy begins when an ordinary day stops being ordinary. And on September 13th, 2006, that moment came to Dawson College in Montreal. The building itself was familiar to thousands of people. Dawson had been part of Montreal's educational landscape for decades. It was a place where young people came to prepare for university, careers, and adult life. Its corridors were designed for movement and learning, not fear. Yet within minutes, those same corridors would become places of uncertainty. Students began running. Others searched for somewhere to hide. Doors were closed. People tried to understand what was happening through fragments of information. Outside, the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Police were responding. Emergency services were moving toward the college. And inside the building, the people who had been studying, talking, eating, and walking between classes were suddenly forced to make decisions that no student should ever have to make. Where do I go? Do I run? Do I hide? Is it safe to open this door? Is the person beside me okay? Where are my friends? Where is my brother? Where is my daughter? Where is my teacher? And perhaps the most frightening question of all, is the gunman still nearby? 2 Montreal police officers happened to be in the area because of an unrelated matter when they heard the reports of gunfire. They moved toward the college rather than simply remaining outside. Other officers followed, and a larger police response began to form around Dawson. Inside, the situation was unfolding at a speed that made every second matter. The officers did not know exactly what they were going to find. They knew only that there was an armed attacker somewhere inside a crowded college, and there were students trapped between him and the exits. The response would eventually become one of the most closely examined elements of the Dawson shooting. The memory of another Montreal school shooting, the 1989 École Polytechnique massacre, still hung over the city. 17 years earlier, 14 women had been murdered at that institution. Now Montreal was once again watching an educational institution become the target of an armed attacker. But this time, the response was different. Police officers entered. They moved toward the danger. And within a short period, the confrontation with Gill came to an end. Gill was shot in the arm by police. Then he took his own life. The attack itself had lasted only around 18 minutes. 18 minutes. It is an almost incomprehensibly short amount of time when measured against an academic semester, a school year, or a human life. But 18 minutes can be an eternity when someone is hiding in a locked room, listening for footsteps. 18 minutes can be long enough for a parent to begin calling a child again and again. 18 minutes can be long enough for a student to believe that everything they knew has disappeared. And 18 minutes can be long enough to divide thousands of lives into a before and an after. When the shooting stopped, Dawson College did not immediately become peaceful. The gunman was dead. But the crisis was only beginning. Emergency crews had to reach the wounded. Police had to secure the building. Students had to be evacuated. Hospitals had to prepare for a sudden influx of casualties. Families had to find out whether their sons and daughters were alive. And somewhere within that chaos, medical personnel were fighting to save people whose lives had been changed in seconds. Montreal General Hospital activated its emergency mass casualty procedures. The first injured people began arriving. Doctors and nurses had to work quickly. There was no time to fully understand the story of the attack. No time to process the horror. The priority was simply to treat the wounded. At Dawson, however, the reality was becoming clearer. Anastasia D'Souza was dead. Other people had been injured. The building had been transformed into a crime scene. And Montreal was beginning to understand what had happened. The first reports were incomplete. Early numbers changed as information came in. News organizations tried to determine how many people had been shot, how many were injured, and whether the gunman had acted alone. Rumors moved quickly. The truth moved more slowly. This is one of the defining characteristics of a mass casualty event. In the first hours, nobody has the whole picture. One person knows what happened in a hallway. Another knows what happened outside. A police officer knows what officers encountered. A doctor knows what arrived at the hospital. A student knows what they saw. A parent knows only that their child has not answered the phone. And somewhere among those fragments, investigators begin reconstructing the truth. But there was one fact that could not be changed by a later investigation. One student was dead. Her name was Anastasia D'Souza. She was 18 years old. She had come to Dawson to study. She had walked into that building expecting to continue her education. She did not know that September 13th would become the last day of her life. And nobody around her knew it either. That may be the most unsettling part of any tragedy like this. The morning does not announce what the afternoon will become. There is no visible line separating an ordinary day from catastrophe. A student can walk through a doorway at noon, believing they will walk back out an hour later. A parent can say goodbye in the morning, without realizing it is the last goodbye. A friend can send a message expecting an answer. A teacher can begin a lesson, believing the greatest problem they will face that day is a late assignment. Then, suddenly, the rules change. At Dawson, the rules changed with the arrival of one-armed man. Kim Veer-Gill had come prepared. He had weapons. He had ammunition. And he had made the decision to bring violence into a place filled largely with young people. That fact would later raise difficult questions about his history, his fascination with firearms, his online presence, his thoughts about death, and the warning signs that surrounded him before September 13th. Investigators would search for explanations. Journalists would search for motives. Experts would debate the meaning of his behavior. The public would ask whether the attack could have been prevented. But those questions belong later in the story. For now, there is only the moment when Dawson changed. Imagine the college just before the shooting. Students moving through the building. People thinking about lunch. Someone looking at the clock. Someone wondering whether they had enough time to make it to their next class. Someone planning what they would do after school. And among them, Anastasia D'Souza, 18 years old. First semester. A future still unwritten. Then the first shots. A sound that did not belong in a college. A sound that transformed confusion into terror. A sound that sent people running. A sound that would become permanently associated with September 13th, 2006. Within minutes, the building was surrounded by police. Within minutes, emergency crews were moving toward the wounded. Within minutes, the future that had seemed so certain for one young woman had disappeared. And within minutes, Montreal had gained another date that would never be forgotten. September 13th. Dawson College. Anastasia D'Souza. Kim Veer-Gill. 18 minutes. One building. One attack. And hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives that would never again be exactly the same. But the most haunting question was not yet about what had happened inside Dawson. It was about what had happened before. How does a person arrive at the point where they decide to carry weapons into a college? What had been happening in Kimveer Gill's life in the days, weeks, and years before September 13th? Were there moments when someone could have recognized what was coming? Were there warning signs? Were there opportunities to intervene? Or was a final decision hidden behind an ordinary face until the moment the weapons appeared? Those questions would become central to the investigation. But there was another question, quieter and far more human. Who was Anastasia D'Souza before the world knew her only as a victim? To answer that question, we have to step away from the gunman. We have to leave the headlines behind. We have to return to Dawson before the sirens, before the police tape, before the memorials. We have to return to a normal school day. Because before Anastasia became a name remembered at a memorial, she was a young woman with a life. And before Dawson became associated with one of Canada's most shocking school shootings, it was simply a college, a place full of ordinary people living ordinary lives. That is where our story truly begins. Not with the gun, not with the killer, but with the life that existed before the violence came through the doors. On September 13th, 2006, Anastasia D'Souza entered Dawson College, expecting another day of her first semester. She did not know that history was already moving toward her. None of the students did. None of the teachers did. None of the families waiting at home did. And for the next 18 minutes, the distance between an ordinary afternoon and a national tragedy would collapse. The world outside would eventually learn the name Dawson. But inside those walls, there were people who had names of their own. People who were afraid. People who ran. People who hid. People who were wounded. People who survived. And one young woman whose life ended there. Her name was Anastasia D'Souza. And this is a story of what happened on September 13th, 2006. There are moments in history that become unforgettable because of what happened in them. And then there are moments that become unforgettable because of what people thought was happening just before everything changed. At Dawson College, the difference between those two moments was almost impossible to see. It was just after midday on September 13th, 2006. Montreal was moving through another weekday. The city had its own rhythm. Cars crossed intersections. Buses carried students and office workers through the streets. People hurried toward lunch, toward meetings, toward classes. Inside Dawson College, young people were doing what young people do when they believe the day ahead of them is ordinary. They were thinking about themselves, about exams, about friends, about relationships, about money, about what they were going to eat, about what they were going to do that evening. Nobody was thinking about survival. That is what makes the first moments of a mass shooting so difficult to comprehend. There is no announcement, no warning bell, no voice telling everyone that their normal lives have ended. There is simply a moment when something happens that does not make sense. A strange sound, a sudden movement, a person running, someone shouting, and then another sound, gunfire. At first, the human mind tries to explain away what it cannot accept. Maybe something fell. Maybe someone is playing a stupid prank. Maybe there is construction nearby. Maybe those noises are coming from outside. Maybe someone misunderstood. But the sound comes again. And this time, there is no reasonable explanation left. People begin to run. The building itself seems to change. The same hallways that had felt familiar only seconds earlier become unfamiliar. Every doorway becomes a question. Every intersection becomes a blind corner. Every distant sound carries the possibility of danger. Students who had never spoken to one another begin communicating through gestures. Get down. Stay here. Don't move. Don't open the door. Wait. The instinct to survive takes over. And somewhere in that enormous building, Anastasia D'Souza is caught inside the unfolding nightmare. She is 18 years old. She has only recently begun college. Her life is still at the beginning of its adult chapter. There are things she has not yet done, people she has not yet met, places she has not yet seen. decisions she has not yet made. At 18, the future is usually discussed in years. What will you study? Where will you work? Will you go to university? Will you travel? Who will you become? Nobody asks an 18-year-old to imagine the end of her life. Nobody expects that a normal school day could suddenly become the last day she will ever see. But violence does not care about the plans people make. At approximately 12:40 p.m., Kimveer Gill began his attack. He was not a student rushing to class. He was 25 years old and had arrived at Dawson armed. The difference between Gill and everyone around him was not merely that he carried weapons. It was that he had come with intention. He had made a decision before he reached the campus. The people inside Dawson had not. They were reacting. He was acting. That imbalance would define everything that followed. Gill opened fire outside the college before moving into the building. People scattered. Some ran toward exits. Others moved away from the gunfire without knowing where safety was. The attack did not unfold like a scene in a movie, where every character understands exactly what is happening. Real terror is disorganized. People trip. People freeze. People turn in the wrong direction. People call someone they love. People try doors. People hide beneath desks or behind furniture. People whisper. People cry. People become silent. And some people become very practical. They help someone who has fallen. They press a hand against a wound. They tell another person to stay down. They look for an exit. They try to remember where they are. In the middle of that confusion, strangers can become lifelines. A person who had never mattered to you 5 minutes earlier can suddenly become the person holding your hand while you wait for help. That is another part of the Dawson story that can easily disappear behind the name of the gunman. The attacker is one person. The people affected are many. Every victim has a story that continues beyond the moment of violence. Every survivor carries a version of the event that only they can fully know. One student may remember the first sound. Another may remember the face of a friend. Another may remember the feeling of the floor beneath them. Another may remember the moment the police finally appeared. Another may remember a phone call that would not connect. Another may remember nothing at all. Trauma does not preserve memories neatly. It can distort them. It can sharpen certain details and erase others. Years later, a survivor may remember the smallest thing, a hallway, a doorway, a particular expression on someone's face, while the larger sequence of events remains blurred. That is why the physical reconstruction of the Dawson shooting is only one part of the story. The other part exists inside the people who were there. For those who escaped, September 13th did not end when the gunman died. It followed them home. It entered their sleep. It entered their conversations. It entered the spaces between ordinary sounds. A slammed door could sound different. A loud noise could trigger a memory. A crowded room could feel different. A school hallway could never again be just a hallway. And for Anastasia's family, there would be no return to normal. There would only be the moment before the phone call and the moment after it. But during the shooting, nobody knew what the final number of victims would be. The information coming from Dawson was fragmented. Reports moved through police channels, hospitals, newsrooms, and telephone calls. The first reports often contradicted one another. There were different estimates of the wounded, different descriptions of the scene, different rumors about the gunman. This is what happens in the first hours of catastrophe. Everyone knows something. Nobody knows everything. Outside Dawson, the streets began filling with police vehicles and emergency personnel. The presence of so many officers told Montreal residents that something serious had happened. But even then, the full scale was unclear. For parents and relatives, uncertainty could be more frightening than confirmed bad news. If your daughter attends Dawson, you do not necessarily need to know that a shooting has occurred. You need to know whether she is alive. If your son is inside the building, you do not need a press conference. You need his voice. You need him to answer the phone. You need a message that says, "I'm okay." But during an emergency, phone networks can become overwhelmed. Students may be hiding. Phones may be silent. People may not know what is safe. And so families wait. They call. They call again. They watch television. They search for information. They listen to every new report. They look at photographs of the college and wonder whether the person they love is somewhere behind those windows. Meanwhile, inside the building, police officers are moving toward the source of the gunfire. 2 Montreal police officers happened to be nearby when the shooting began. Their immediate movement toward Dawson will become an important part of the response. They were not entering a building where the threat was theoretical. They were moving toward an armed attacker. The difference matters. An active shooter situation is governed by seconds. Every moment in which the gunman remains active is another opportunity for someone else to be hurt. So the officers moved. Other units followed. The response expanded. The college was becoming surrounded. But inside, the people hiding did not know how close the police were. They did not know whether the attacker had moved to another floor. They did not know whether there was more than one gunman. They did not know whether opening a door would save them or expose them. Imagine being 18 years old and having to make that decision. You hear something outside. You cannot see the hallway. You know someone has a gun. Do you stay where you are? Do you run? Do you help someone else? Do you wait for the police? And what if the police are already outside the door? In those moments, ordinary logic becomes almost useless. The body takes control. Heart rate rises. Breathing changes. Muscles tighten. Attention narrows. The brain begins searching for threats. A person may become intensely aware of tiny details while losing the larger picture. A shoe moving under a door. A shadow passing across a window. A voice in the hallway. A distant command. The sound of footsteps. The silence afterward. Silence can be worse than noise. Because when you hear gunfire, you know something is happening. When the building suddenly becomes quiet, you do not know whether it's over, or whether the gunman is simply somewhere else. At Dawson, the confrontation would soon reach its conclusion. Police encountered Gill. He was shot in the arm. Then Gill turned the weapon on himself. He died at the scene. The man who had entered Dawson carrying weapons was gone, but the danger had not disappeared instantly. Police still had to search the building. They had to determine whether anyone else was involved. They had to secure rooms. They had to identify victims. They had to protect emergency personnel. And they had to move through a building where only minutes earlier students had been running for their lives. Eventually, the immediate threat was over. The next phase began. The rescue, the evacuation, the identification, the counting. One injured person. Another. And then the realization that someone was missing. Anastasia D'Souza. Her name would soon become associated with the tragedy. But in those first moments, she was not yet a historical figure. She was a person someone was desperately looking for. A daughter. A friend. A student. Someone whose absence would become impossible to explain away. When the final toll began to emerge, Canada learned that 19 people had been injured. 1 student had died. The gunman was also dead. The numbers were eventually repeated so many times that they became part of the historical record. 1 dead victim. 19 wounded. 1 dead attacker. But numbers cannot describe what happened to the people behind them. 19 injuries can mean 19 different experiences. Some wounds heal physically. Others leave scars. Some people walk away. Others require long treatment. Some survivors return to school. Others struggle with the idea of returning to any crowded building at all. And the family of the person who died is left with something that cannot be measured by statistics. Absence. A chair that remains empty. A bedroom that looks the same. Photographs that suddenly become painful. A voice that exists only in memory. Plans that will never happen. Questions that have no answer. The Dawson shooting, therefore, cannot be reduced to the 18 minutes when the gunman was active. Those 18 minutes were only the beginning of a much longer story. The story of grief. The story of trauma. The story of investigation. The story of a community asking how something like this could happen. And the story of a country once again confronting the reality of gun violence. Canada had seen school shootings before. Montreal had already endured the horror of École Polytechnique in 1989. 17 years later, Dawson became another name permanently attached to that history. But there was a difference. The Dawson attack was not a repeat of Polytechnique. The circumstances were different. The victims were different. The perpetrator was different. The known motivations were different. And yet the psychological shadow of the earlier massacre was impossible to ignore. Montreal had already learned that a school could become a crime scene. Now it was learning that the memory of one massacre could not protect a city from another. That realization would affect the police response. It would affect emergency planning. It would affect the national conversation about firearms. And it would affect Dawson College itself. For years afterward, people would remember September 13th. Some would remember where they were standing. Some would remember who they were with. Some would remember the first moment they realized something terrible had happened. Others would remember the silence after the shooting. And some would remember Anastasia. That is where the story needs to slow down. Because when we tell a story like this, there is always a temptation to rush toward the answers. Who was Kimveer Gill? Why did he choose Dawson? How did he obtain his weapons? What did investigators discover? What did he leave behind? What did the police find? What did the evidence reveal? Those questions will come. But before we follow the killer into his past, we should understand the people whose lives he entered. Especially Anastasia de Souza. She was 18. She was beginning adulthood. She had entered Dawson as a student, not as a victim. She had a future. That future was taken from her in a matter of minutes. And that is why the first chapter of this story should not belong entirely to the man holding the weapon. It should belong to the people who had every reason to believe they would survive an ordinary afternoon. The students who came to class. The teachers who came to teach. The employees who came to work. The families who expected their loved ones home later that day. And Anastasia, who walked into Dawson with a future ahead of her. At 12:40 p.m., that future became history. By the time the police had secured the building, the world outside was beginning to ask what had happened. But the people inside did not need the answer yet. They needed to get out. They needed medical attention. They needed to find their friends. They needed to see their families. They needed to know who had survived. And for one family, the answer would be devastating. The girl they were waiting for would not be coming home. Her name would soon appear in newspapers. Her photograph would be shared. Her life would be summarized in a few sentences. But those sentences could never contain 18 years. 18 years of birthdays. 18 years of family memories. 18 years of laughter, arguments, school days, celebrations, disappointments, hopes, and plans. That is the problem with the language of tragedy. It compresses human beings. A life becomes a name. A name becomes a number. A number becomes a statistic. And eventually, a statistic becomes a footnote. This story should resist that. Because Anastasia de Souza was never a statistic. She was a young woman who happened to be at Dawson on a September afternoon. She was living the beginning of her life. And then someone else's decision ended it. That is the line that separates the past from the present. The line between an ordinary school day and the Dawson shooting. The line between the girl Anastasia was and the victim the world later came to know. And as Montreal struggled to understand what had happened, another story was waiting to be uncovered. The story of the man who brought the guns. Kimveer Singh Gill had not appeared out of nowhere. His life had existed before Dawson. There were interests. There were behaviors. There were beliefs. There were digital traces. There were signs of preparation. There were questions about his fascination with weapons and death. And there was a final decision that brought him to a college campus, carrying enough ammunition to turn an ordinary day into a massacre. Understanding that path does not excuse what he did. It does not diminish the suffering of the victims. And it does not provide a simple answer. But it may help us understand how warning signs can exist without anyone recognizing the final picture. The investigation would eventually turn backward, away from Dawson, away from the bodies and blood, away from the chaos, toward Gill's life before September 13th. Investigators would begin asking what he had been doing, what he had said, what he had written, what he had purchased, who he had spoken to, what he believed, and when he had made the decision to act. But before those questions could be answered, there was one immediate reality. Dawson College was no longer simply a school. It was a crime scene. Montreal was no longer simply waiting for students to come home. Families were waiting for confirmation that their children were alive. And one family was beginning the process of learning that theirs was not. September 13th, 2006 would end. The city would go dark. The college would eventually empty. The streets would become quieter. But for the people touched by what happened, there would be no return to the way things had been that morning. The next day would arrive. Then another. Then another. Classes would eventually resume. Doors would open again. Students would walk through the same corridors. The building would once again fill with voices. But memory would remain. A place can be repaired. Walls can be cleaned. Glass can be replaced. A schedule can be rewritten. A school can reopen. But a life cannot be restored. And that is the shadow that hangs over Dawson. The gunmen came and went. The police left. The ambulances left. The cameras eventually disappeared. The headlines moved on to other stories. But Anastasia did not come home. And the survivors did not leave the experience behind simply because the calendar moved forward. The real story of Dawson, therefore, begins with a contradiction. It is a story about an event that lasted minutes and consequences that lasted years. A story about a gunman whose actions occupied a few moments, but whose victims carried the consequences for the rest of their lives. A story about an 18-year-old whose future ended before it had really begun. And a story about a city that had already learned the terrible lesson that schools are not automatically safe simply because they are filled with young people. On September 13th, 2006, the people inside Dawson thought they were living through an ordinary afternoon. They were wrong. They just did not know it yet. And neither did Anastasia. That is where we leave the first moments. Not with the gunman. Not with the police. Not with the investigation. But with the image of a young woman entering a college at the beginning of her adult life, unaware that within less than an hour, her name would become permanently connected to one of the darkest days in Montreal's modern history. To understand what was lost that afternoon, we must first understand who she was. Because before the world remembers the way Anastasia D'Souza died, it should remember that she lived. At first, there was nothing remarkable about September 13th, 2006. It was a Wednesday. Another weekday in Montreal. Another morning when thousands of students woke up, got dressed, gathered their books, checked the time, and left home believing they would return later that same day. Dawson College was already alive. Students moved through its corridors carrying backpacks and coffee cups. Conversations overlapped in the hallways. Doors opened and closed. Classes began. People checked schedules. Friends passed one another and stopped for a few seconds before continuing on their way. The building was full of the kind of noise that disappears into the background when you hear it every day. Footsteps. Voices. Laughter. The scrape of chairs. The sound of people moving from one place to another. Nothing about it suggested that Dawson would soon become one of the most recognizable crime scenes in Canada. There was no visible warning. No sign on the wall. No unknown cement. No moment when the people inside could look around and say, something terrible is about to happen. That is one of the cruelest characteristics of ordinary life. It does not tell us when it is about to end. At approximately 12:40 in the afternoon, a 25-year-old man named Kimveer Singh Gill arrived at Dawson College. He was carrying firearms. He had ammunition. And he had come prepared to use them. What happened next would unfold with terrifying speed. The first gunshots shattered the normal rhythm of the campus. People reacted before they understood. Some ran. Some ducked. Some froze. Some searched for friends. Others simply followed the person closest to them because, in a moment of terror, instinct can replace thought. The sound of gunfire moved through the college. A place designed to educate suddenly became a place where students were trying to stay alive. Imagine confusion. You are sitting in a classroom. You hear something outside. Someone looks toward the door. Another person asks what happened. Then the sound comes again, closer, louder. And now nobody is talking about class anymore. The room changes. Faces change. People look at one another differently. The person sitting beside you is no longer just another student. They are another human being caught in the same danger. And the person on the other side of the door is no longer simply someone walking through a hallway. They could be anyone. They could be police. They could be a student. They could be the gunman. There is no way to know. That uncertainty is part of the horror. The mind searches for certainty because certainty feels like safety. But during an active shooting, certainty disappears. The people at Dawson had to make decisions with incomplete information. Run or hide. Stay or move. Call someone or remain silent. Open the door or keep it locked. Help someone or protect yourself. For some people, those decisions took only seconds. For others, the seconds became minutes. And while the students were trying to understand the danger, police were already moving toward it. 2 Montreal police officers happened to be nearby because of another matter when reports of gunfire reached them. They responded immediately. Their decision to move toward the building would become an important part of the Dawson story. The police response was shaped by lessons learned from previous tragedies, including the 1989 massacre at École Polytechnique. 17 years earlier, Montreal had witnessed one of the most devastating attacks in Canadian history. 14 women had been murdered at a school in the city. That memory had not disappeared. Now, once again, police officers were approaching an educational institution where an armed attacker was believed to be inside. They did not know how many victims there would be. They did not know exactly where the gunman was. They did not know whether there were other attackers. They knew only that every minute mattered. Inside Dawson, the world had narrowed to survival. Students hid. Some barricaded themselves in side rooms. Others searched for ways out. Some ran through corridors without knowing whether they were running towards safety. Others remained still, hoping the danger would pass. And for those trapped in side rooms, the absence of information became its own kind of torture. They could not see what was happening. They could hear it. That was enough. A sound in the hallway. A distant movement. A voice. Then silence. Then another burst of panic. People began reaching for their phones. Messages were sent. Calls were made. Parents tried to contact their children. Friends searched for one another. But there was no single source of information capable of telling everyone what was happening. The truth was scattered across hundreds of people. One student had seen the attacker. Another had seen someone injured. Another had escaped through an exit. Another was still hiding. A police officer knew the gunman had been confronted. A doctor knew injured people were on the way. A parent knew only that a child was not answering. This is how a disaster feels while it is happening. Not like a complete story. Like fragments. Pieces that do not yet fit together. And somewhere among those fragments was Anastasia D'Souza, 18 years old, a first-year student, studying social science in the International Business Profile. She was at the beginning of a life that still seemed full of possibilities. There is something particularly painful about the age of 18. It is old enough to make decisions about your future, young enough to believe you have plenty of time to change them. At 18, a person is often still discovering who they are. The world is opening. New friends appear. New responsibilities arrive. The future begins to feel less like something distant and more like something that can actually be built. Anastasia had entered Dawson as a student. She had not entered history. She had no reason to imagine that one day people who had never met her would know her name. But that is what happened. The shooting ended quickly. Police encountered Gill. He was shot in the arm. Then he killed himself. The attacker was dead. The immediate threat was over. But for the people inside Dawson, over did not mean safe. Police still had to search the building. Emergency crews still had to reach wounded people. Students still had to be evacuated. Families still had to find their children. Hospitals still had to prepare. And the city still had to understand what had happened. Montreal General Hospital activated its mass casualty response procedures. Doctors, nurses, and emergency personnel prepared for incoming victims. The wounded began arriving. Every patient carried a story. A bullet wound. A desperate escape. A friend who had helped. A room where someone had hidden. A hallway where someone had fallen. Medical workers did not have time to absorb the scale of the tragedy. They had to work. Pressure. Bandages. Surgery. Assessment. Movement. Treatment. Another patient. Then another. Outside, the scale of the police response was becoming visible. Vehicles gathered. Officers moved through the area. The college was secured. The streets around Dawson became crowded with emergency personnel. Parents and relatives began arriving. Some were searching for information. Some were looking for their children. Some had heard about the shooting through television or radio before they could reach anyone they knew. And some were waiting for a phone call that would never come. The first casualty figures were uncertain. Reports changed. Some early accounts described different numbers of wounded. This is common in the first hours of a disaster. The final picture emerges slowly. Eventually, the number would settle. 19 people had been injured. 1 student had been killed. The gunman was dead. But one of those numbers was a person, Anastasia D'Souza, 18. First-year student. Dead. The sentence is simple. The reality behind it is not. Because when someone dies unexpectedly, the people who love them do not experience one death. They experience the disappearance of an entire future. There will be no next birthday, no next semester, no graduation, no future career, no ordinary argument that later becomes a funny family story, no future photograph, no unexpected phone call, no chance to see who that person would become. Death does not only remove the present, it removes all the unwritten moments that were supposed to follow it. That is what was taken from Anastasia. And that is what her family would have to live with. For the rest of the afternoon, however, the public did not yet know the full human story. They knew there had been a shooting. They knew people were injured. They knew the gunman was dead. They knew someone had been killed. The details were still arriving. News reports were being updated. Television cameras were turning Dawson into a national image. The college appeared on screens across Canada. Police vehicles. Emergency workers. Students being escorted away. People crying. People looking at their phones. People embracing one another. The visual language of disaster was taking shape. But the people inside that image were experiencing something far more personal. One student was thinking about a friend. Another was thinking about a parent. Another was thinking about whether they would ever feel safe at school again. Another was simply trying to understand how they had survived. And somewhere, a family was learning that Anastasia would not be coming home. There would be memorials later. Flowers. Photographs. Candles. Messages. Names. There would be moments when people spoke about Anastasia and remembered her as a daughter and student rather than a victim. But before those memorials came the rawness of the first day, the shock, the disbelief, the questions, the need to confirm, the need to see someone alive, the need to know. That is the part of tragedy that television cannot fully capture. The cameras can show a crowd. They cannot show the private moment when someone realizes that the person they were waiting for is gone. They can show an ambulance. They cannot show the silence inside a family home after the phone stops ringing. They can show police tape. They cannot show the memory of a person sitting at the dinner table. And they can show a photograph of a victim. But they cannot show the future that photograph represents. That is why the story of Dawson should not begin and end with the attacker. Kimveer Gill would dominate the headlines. His name would be printed. His photograph would circulate. His history would be investigated. His behavior would be analyzed. The public would want to understand him. But understanding a killer should never require forgetting the people he killed. The more we look at Gill, the more we risk allowing him to occupy the center of the story. So for this moment, we leave him in the background. Instead, we remain at Dawson. We remain with the people who were there. We remain with the ordinary world that had been shattered. The hallways would eventually be empty. The classrooms would eventually be cleared. The wounded would be taken to hospitals. The survivors would be reunited with loved ones. The police would begin processing the crime scene. But Dawson would never again be just a college to the people who had been there that day. It would become a place associated with memory. A place where someone might remember exactly where they were standing when they heard the first shots. A place where another person might remember hiding. A place where someone else might remember carrying a wounded friend. A place where Anastasia's final moments will remain forever tied to the building. And yet, the tragedy cannot be understood only through the physical scene. The deeper questions were already beginning to form. Why Dawson? Why that day? Why those weapons? Why had Gil decided to attack? How long had he been preparing? Did he intend to die? Had he wanted to kill specific people? Was the attack connected to a broader ideology? Were there warning signs? Could someone have intervened? These questions would become the foundation of the investigation, but none of them could bring Anastasia back. None could erase what happened. None could restore the 19 injured people to the exact lives they had before that afternoon. And none could erase the fear that had entered Dawson. The immediate crisis had ended. The long aftermath had begun. Years later, people would still study the psychological consequences of September 13th. Researchers would examine survivors. The college would examine its response. Emergency services would examine theirs. Police tactics would be discussed. Firearms policy would become part of a wider national debate. Mental health warning signs would be debated. School security would be reconsidered. But every discussion about systems and policies ultimately returned to human beings, students, families, survivors, victims, Anastasia. That is where the meaning of the Dawson shooting lives, not only in the number of shots, not only in the number of wounded, not only in the name of the gunman. It lives in the lives that were interrupted. It lives in survivors who walked away from Dawson carrying invisible wounds. It lives in the families who waited for news. It lives in the emergency workers who entered the aftermath. And it lives in the memory of an 18-year-old woman whose life was cut short while she was doing something completely ordinary, going to college. That is perhaps the most disturbing detail of all. Anastasia did not go to Dawson that day expecting danger. She did not know she was entering a place that would become a crime scene. She did not know that the person arriving with weapons had made a decision that would change her life. She did not know that her name would later be spoken in memorials. She did not know that journalists would write about her. She did not know that researchers would study the event. She did not know that strangers would eventually search for her story. She simply went to school. And then, in a matter of minutes, everything changed. For the people who survived, September 13th will become a date that divided time before the shooting, after the shooting, before Dawson, after Dawson, before the phone call, after the phone call, before the memory, after the memory. And for Anastasia's family, there was an even sharper division before losing her. After losing her, the gunman had died. The police response had ended. The emergency rooms were treating the wounded. The college would eventually be secured. But there was no emergency procedure capable of reversing death. No police tactic capable of bringing back the dead. No investigation capable of restoring the future Anastasia had lost. That future belonged to her, until it was taken away. And as the afternoon moved toward evening, Montreal began to absorb the scale of what had happened. The city had seen this kind of horror before, but every tragedy feels new to the people inside it. The old memories of Polytechnique returned. The questions returned. The fear returned. And now there was another name to remember. Dawson College. September 13th, 2006. Anastasia D'Souza. Kim Veer Gill. 19 wounded. 1 student dead. 1 attacker dead. The numbers were simple. The human reality was not, because the story of Dawson was never really about 18 minutes. It was about everything that came before those 18 minutes, and everything that came after. It was about the young woman Anastasia had been before her death. It was about the man Gil had been before he picked up his weapons. It was about the decisions that brought him to Dawson. It was about the people who might have seen warning signs. It was about the people who survived. It was about the emergency workers who rushed toward danger. It was about the families waiting outside. And it was about a college that had to learn how to exist again after becoming the site of a massacre. The answers would not come all at once. They would emerge slowly, from police records, from witnesses, from Gil's digital footprint, from his history, from the weapons, from the crime scene, from interviews, from the memories of survivors. But before those answers could be assembled, there was one thing the public needed to understand. This had not happened in a vacuum. Kimveer Gill had a life before Dawson. He had interests. He had relationships. He had beliefs. He had access to weapons. He had expressed thoughts about death and violence. There were pieces of his story scattered throughout the years before the shooting. The investigation would later attempt to assemble those pieces into a picture, but there would never be a single sentence capable of explaining why a person chooses to enter a college carrying guns and deliberately open fire. There would be evidence. There would be theories. There would be patterns. There would be questions. But no explanation could undo the result. One young woman was dead. 19 others were injured. Hundreds more would carry the psychological consequences. And a city was once again forced to confront the possibility that violence could arrive in a place where young people were supposed to feel safe. That is why the first image of this story should not be a gun. It should be a college, a normal college, a place filled with students who believed they were simply moving through another Wednesday, a place where an 18-year-old girl named Anastasia D'Souza was living the beginning of her adult life, a place where, at 12:40 in the afternoon, the ordinary world broke, and once it broke, there was no way to put it back together exactly as it had been. The people who escaped would leave Dawson. The wounded would be taken to hospitals. The police would remove the threat. The cameras would eventually leave. The city would eventually sleep. But Anastasia would never walk out of that building, and that is where the story must remain for a moment, with her. Not as a statistic, not as a headline, not as the sole fatality, but as an 18-year-old woman who had a life before September 13th. Because if we want to understand the true way to what happened at Dawson College, we must first understand what existed before the tragedy took it away. We must remember the life, before we examine the death, and before we follow the killer into the darkness of his past. We must look at the young woman whose future was taken from her. Her story begins there, before the gunfire, before the sirens, before the headlines, before Dawson became a place people associate with tragedy. It begins with Anastasia D'Souza, 18 years old, walking into college on an ordinary September day, unaware that she was about to become part of stories she never chose to enter. Before Dawson College became the place where Montreal will remember gunfire, it was something much more ordinary. It was a school, not a fortress, not a monument to tragedy, not a crime scene. A school. A place where thousands of young people arrived carrying backpacks, notebooks, coffee cups, unfinished assignments, private worries, and plans for the future. Dawson had been founded in 1968 as Quebec's first English-language cégep, and it opened its doors to its first 1,200 students in September 1969. By the 2006 to 2007 academic year, the college was serving thousands of full-time students across dozens of programs. That history matters because Dawson was never simply a building. It was part of Montreal's educational landscape. For generations of students, the college represented a transition. High school was behind them. Adulthood was beginning. The decisions made inside its classrooms could influence where a student went next, what career they pursued, what university they attended, and eventually what kind of life they built. For an 18-year-old arriving at Dawson in September 2006, the campus could feel like the beginning of something, a new environment, new faces, new independence, a different rhythm from high school. For Anastasia D'Souza, that transition was still fresh. She was a first-semester student. Her life at Dawson had barely begun, and that is important to remember when we reconstruct the setting of the tragedy. The college was not filled with people who expected danger. It was filled with people who expected opportunity. The difference between those two ideas will become devastatingly clear on September 13th. Montreal itself was an important part of the setting. The city is built around movement. People cross its streets on foot, by car, by bus, by metro, and bicycle. Different languages and cultures overlap. Neighborhoods change within a few blocks. Students from different backgrounds meet in classrooms and cafeterias. The city can feel dense and intimate at the same time. Dawson reflected that character. It was an urban college. Students did not arrive in an isolated campus surrounded by empty fields. They arrived in the middle of Montreal. The college sat in a busy part of the city, close to major streets and public transportation, with the surrounding neighborhood continuing its ordinary life outside the walls. That detail will become significant on the day of the shooting, because when violence entered Dawson, it did not happen in some remote place where the outside world could be kept at a distance. It happened in the middle of a living city, and when the first reports began spreading, Montreal reacted almost immediately. But before that happened, Dawson was simply Dawson. Students had schedules. Teachers had lessons. Employees had responsibilities. The college had its routines. People knew which entrances they preferred. They knew where to meet friends. They knew where to eat. They knew which corridors were crowded between classes, and which ones became quieter at certain times of day. These small details are easy to overlook when looking backward, but they are precisely what makes a place feel normal. Every school develops its own geography in the minds of the people who use it. A student might know a particular staircase without ever thinking about its name. They might recognize a classroom by the number before they consciously register the walls. They might know where sunlight falls through a window at a certain hour. They might know which door is closest to the street. They might know where their friends usually wait between classes. A building becomes familiar through repetition. The same paths, the same doors, the same faces, until something happens that makes every familiar place suddenly frightening. Dawson was a large institution, and its size could make the experience of being inside it different depending on where a person was standing. A student in one classroom might have no idea what was happening somewhere else. Someone in a corridor might hear something before another person did. Someone near an entrance might have a completely different view of the attack from someone inside a classroom. This would later become important when investigators attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events. The tragedy did not happen from a single viewpoint. It happened simultaneously to hundreds of people, each experiencing only a small portion of it. That is why there would never be one perfect memory of September 13th. There would be many. Some memories would overlap. Some would contradict one another. Some would contain details that others had never seen. Together, they would form the outline of what happened. But on the morning of September 13th, none of that mattered yet. The college was preparing for another school day. The academic year had just begun. Students were still becoming accustomed to their schedules. First-semester students were learning the physical layout of the campus. Some were meeting classmates for the first time. Others were already settling into routines. And somewhere within that crowd was Anastasia. Imagine her as she was before the tragedy reduced her identity to a single line in a historical record. 18 years old. A student. A young woman entering a new chapter. There's a tendency, when telling stories about mass violence, to treat the location as though it were waiting for the tragedy. It was not. Dawson did not exist for September 13th. September 13th was imposed upon Dawson. The college had its own history before that day, and after the shooting, it would continue to have a history. That distinction became particularly important to the Dawson community. In the years that followed, the institution repeatedly emphasized that it would not allow the shooting to become its entire identity. That decision can be seen in what happened after the attack. The community mourned. It remembered. It created memorials. But it also returned to education. Students came back. Teachers returned. Classes continued. The college eventually created the Peace Garden as a living memorial to Anastasia and as a place connected with the community's commitment to peace and nonviolence. That future response tells us something about the place before the tragedy. Dawson was built around the idea that young people should be able to learn, question, disagree, grow, and imagine a future. That is exactly why an attack there felt so profoundly unnatural. A school is supposed to point forward. A shooting points toward death. A classroom is supposed to create possibilities. A gunman creates fear. A college cafeteria is supposed to be a place where people gather. On September 13th, it became part of a scene of violence. The contrast is what made the attack so psychologically devastating. There was nothing inherently threatening about the building. The danger came from one person who entered it. That distinction will remain important throughout the investigation. The college itself was not the enemy. The students were not the enemy. The teachers were not the enemy. The institution was not the enemy. The violence came from outside the ordinary purpose of the place. And when the attacker arrived, the people inside were forced to respond to something they had never expected to encounter there. That is why the setting needs to be imagined in ordinary terms, not through the eyes of investigators, not through photographs taken after crime, but through the eyes of a student arriving for class. The entrance, the corridors, the classrooms, the atrium, the places where people naturally gathered, the movement of students between activities, the constant sense that somebody was always going somewhere. A school is a machine of movement. Students arrive. Students leave. Classes begin. Classes end. The crowd expands and contracts throughout the day. A person can be surrounded by hundreds of people one moment and standing alone the next. That rhythm will become distorted on September 13th. The movement would change direction. Instead of walking toward classrooms, people would run away from danger. Instead of gathering, people would scatter. Instead of opening doors, people would lock them. Instead of looking for friends, some would search for places to hide. Instead of asking what class they had next, students would ask whether they were safe. The building remained physically the same. The meaning of the building changed. That is one of the most powerful consequences of violence in familiar places. The architecture survives. The memory changes it. A hallway can remain exactly where it was. A door can remain the same color. A staircase can still lead to the same floor. But the person who experienced terror there may never see those objects in quite the same way again. The location becomes layered with memory. Before the shooting, during the shooting, after the shooting, years later. That layering would become part of Dawson's identity. But on September 13th, nobody knew what the building would come to represent. The day began without that knowledge. The weather, the city, the traffic, the school schedule, all of it belonged to the ordinary world. People had no reason to behave as though they were living through history. That is another uncomfortable truth about historical tragedies. People rarely know they are inside history while history is happening. The people inside Dawson were not thinking, "This will be remembered for decades." They were thinking, "What's happening? Where should I go? Where's my friend? Can I get out? Is the door locked? Why is everyone running?" The difference between historical hindsight and lived experience is enormous. We know the ending. They did not. We know that Anastasia would die. They did not. We know Gil would eventually take his own life. They did not. We know the shooting would become one of the defining mass casualty events in Montreal's modern history. They knew only that something terrible was happening. That uncertainty is essential to understanding the terror. If you know the gunman will be dead in 18 minutes, the story feels different. But the people inside Dawson did not have a countdown. They did not know whether the attack would last another 30 seconds or another hour. They did not know whether there was one attacker or several. They did not know whether the exits were safe. They did not know where police were. They did not know whether their friends had escaped. The future was invisible. Only the present existed. And the present was terrifying. The first police officers approaching Dawson were entering that uncertainty too. Although their training gave them a framework for responding to an active shooter, they still had incomplete information. They had to move through an environment where people were fleeing and where the location of the threat was still being established. The decision to move toward the gunfire reflected a major shift in police tactics that had developed through painful experience. Montreal had learned a devastating lesson at École Polytechnique in 1989. The city had already witnessed the consequences of an armed attacker inside an educational institution. That history did not disappear in 2006. If anything, it made the Dawson response more urgent. But the officers entering Dawson were not thinking about history in the abstract. They were responding to a live emergency. Students were inside. An armed man was inside. The threat had to be confronted. And while police moved, another emergency system was beginning to activate outside. Hospitals were preparing for casualties. Montreal General Hospital initiated its mass casualty response, preparing personnel and resources for multiple injured patients. The city was beginning to function as one enormous emergency network. Police, paramedics, hospitals, fire services, college administrators, emergency coordinators, families, news organizations. Everyone had a different role, but nobody yet knew how many people would need help. That uncertainty would soon become one of the central realities of the afternoon. At Dawson, students were being evacuated. Some would emerge shaken but physically unharmed. Others would emerge wounded. Some would be reunited with friends. Some would discover that a friend was missing, and some would be taken to hospitals. The college would later record that 16 people besides Anastasia were injured in the attack, while other contemporary reporting and later summaries used different totals depending on how victims were counted and treated. But statistics cannot describe the atmosphere. Imagine the college after the shooting. The same building that had been full of movement was now filled with emergency personnel. Students were being led away. Police were securing areas. Medical teams were searching for people who needed help. The ordinary sound of college life had disappeared. In its place was a strange combination of urgency and silence. The silence of people waiting for information. The urgency of people who already knew they had been injured. The confusion of people who had escaped but did not yet understand what had happened to everyone else. And outside, Montreal was watching. The images would spread quickly. Police cars, emergency vehicles, students leaving the college, people standing behind barriers, families searching for information. The city was beginning to understand that something extraordinary had happened. Yet Dawson's history was not only about the tragedy. The institution had existed for decades before that day. It had educated generations. It had built programs. It had developed a reputation. It had become part of the lives of students who had long since graduated. The 2006 shooting did not erase that history, but it placed a permanent scar across it for those who had been there. The college would forever contain two versions of itself. The Dawson before September 13th, and the Dawson after. The first was a place of education. The second was also a place of memory. That second identity would eventually become visible through memorials and commemorations. But immediately after the attack, there was no polished memorial. There was only grief. In the days following the shooting, the entrance at 4001 D. Maisonneuve Boulevard became a spontaneous shrine. Flowers, candles, messages, and personal mementos accumulated as people from across Montreal came to express their support. 5 days later, on September 18th, students helped move the flowers aside as thousands returned to college for the first time since the attack. That image says something profound about Dawson. The college did not simply reopen because the building had been declared safe. It reopened because people decided that the gunman would not be allowed to determine what the building meant forever. But that decision came later. On September 13th itself, there was no such certainty. There was only shock. And shock changes the way people see familiar places. A classroom becomes a shelter. A cafeteria becomes a potential target. An entrance becomes a boundary between safety and danger. A window becomes something to look through carefully. A hallway becomes a memory. And the campus becomes a map of decisions made under extreme pressure. This is why the setting matters. Without understanding Dawson as a living institution, It is impossible to understand what was destroyed psychologically that day. The gunman did not simply enter a building. He entered a community made up of people who had relationships, routines, ambitions, and expectations. He interrupted thousands of ordinary lives. Some were interrupted for minutes, some for years. For Anastasia, they were interrupted permanently. That is the cruelest asymmetry in the story. The college continued. The city continued. Other students graduated. New students arrived. Teachers continued teaching. The institution expanded and changed. Memorials were built. Programs developed. Generations moved forward. But Anastasia remained 18 forever. The college's later memorialization of her reflects that reality. Dawson established the Peace Garden as a living memorial, and the institution continues to remember her through commemorations and the Anastasia D'Souza Memorial Award. Her absence became part of the place, not because she was responsible for what happened, but because she was the person whose life was taken there. And perhaps that is the most important thing to understand before moving deeper into the story. Dawson was not a place waiting to become famous. It was a place where people were living. The tragedy came into that living environment and changed it. The attack lasted only a short time. The consequences did not. The gunman died that afternoon. The investigation would eventually slow. The headlines would eventually fade. But the building remained, and people had to decide whether they could continue living, studying, and working inside it. 5 days after the attack, they began to return. That return was not simply administrative. It was psychological. Students were reclaiming a place that had become associated with fear. They were walking back through doors that had become part of the national memory. They were sitting in classrooms knowing that someone had been wounded nearby. They were attempting to resume ordinary life, while knowing that ordinary life had been interrupted. The courage involved in that return is easy to underestimate. Healing does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like walking into a building again, opening a notebook, sitting in a classroom, talking to a friend, going to lunch, laughing, studying, living. Those actions can appear mundane. After trauma, they can be acts of resistance. Dawson's later history would be shaped by precisely that idea. The college would refuse to become defined solely by violence. It would remember Anastasia. It would remember the wounded. It would remember the survivors. But it would also insist on remaining a place of learning. That choice will become one of the central themes of the aftermath. Yet to understand why the attack was so shocking, we must return once more to the Dawson that existed before it. A college filled with young people. A college where students were supposed to argue about ideas rather than run from bullets. A college where a first-year student like Anastasia should have been worrying about classes, not whether she would survive the afternoon. A college where the greatest uncertainty of the day should have been an exam grade or a difficult assignment. Instead, one man brought a completely different reality through the doors. And when he did, the ordinary geography of Dawson became a geography of fear. The entrance, the corridors, the upper atrium, the exits, the rooms, the streets outside. Each location would acquire a new meaning. Years later, people could walk through those spaces and remember. That is what places do after tragedy. They remember for us. A photograph can fade. A newspaper can disappear. A person can stop talking about an event, but a place remains. The walls remain. The doors remain. The floor remains. And every person who experienced something there carries their own invisible map, a map made not from architecture, but from memory. On September 13, 2006, Dawson's map changed. The college became a place divided by time, before the shooting, after the shooting. And at the center of that division was a young woman named Anastasia D'Souza. She had entered Dawson as a student. She became the only person killed by the gunman. The community would eventually create a living memorial to her. But before the memorial existed, there was only the girl, the student, the person, the life. To understand the weight of the tragedy, the next step is not to examine the weapons. It is not to examine the killer's online activity. It is not yet to reconstruct every movement of the police. It is to look at Anastasia herself, because every crime scene contains evidence. Every investigation contains facts. But behind every victim is a life that existed before the crime. And at Dawson, that life belonged to an 18-year-old student who should have had decades ahead of her. On September 13th, she entered the college expecting another day. The city outside continued moving. The school continued functioning. The future seemed ordinary. Then one man walked onto the campus carrying guns, and the ordinary world disappeared. Before we follow that moment further, we need to know who Anastasia was when the world was still normal. Because the true measure of a tragedy is not only the violence that occurred, it is the future that was lost. And Anastasia's future was just beginning. To understand what happened at Dawson College on September 13th, 2006, it is not enough to imagine the building after shooting. A crime scene is always easier to understand than an ordinary place. After violence has happened, every doorway seems significant. Every corridor appears to carry a hidden meaning. Every photograph becomes evidence. Police tape transforms familiar spaces into boundaries. Investigators begin asking what happened here, where people stood, which direction they moved, what they could see and what they could not see. But Dawson did not begin that day as a crime scene. It began as a college. And that distinction is essential, because for the thousands of people who entered Dawson in September 2006, the building was not a place of danger. It was a place of routine. It was somewhere they had learned to navigate almost without thinking. They knew where to go. They knew where to wait. They knew where to meet friends. They knew which corridors became crowded between classes. They knew the feeling of walking through the doors with a schedule in their pocket and the rest of the day still ahead of them. For a student who had been at Dawson for months or years, the building could feel almost like a second home. For someone like Anastasia D'Souza, who was only beginning her first semester, that familiarity was still being created. She was 18. She was learning the rhythms of a new institution. She was learning names, learning classrooms, learning schedules, learning the subtle geography of a place that would eventually become familiar. And that is one of the most painful ironies of the story. She was still in the process of discovering Dawson when Dawson became the place where her life ended. The college itself had a history long before Anastasia arrived. Dawson was founded in 1968 as Quebec's first English-language cégep, opening its doors to its first students the following year. Over the decades, it became an important part of Montreal's educational landscape, serving young people from different backgrounds and preparing them for university, careers, and the next stage of adult life. By 2006, Dawson was not a small school where everyone knew everyone. It was a large, busy institution. Thousands of students passed through its spaces. That mattered. In a large college, anonymity can exist even inside a crowd. A person can walk past hundreds of people without knowing their names. A student can sit beside someone for weeks and never learn anything about their life. At the same time, the same environment can create a powerful sense of community. People share classrooms. They share cafeterias. They share elevators. They share the same streets outside. They complain about the same assignments. They worry about the same exams. They wait for the same buses. The community is not necessarily built through deep friendships. Sometimes it is built simply through repetition, seeing the same faces, walking the same paths, knowing that you belong somewhere. That sense of belonging was part of what made the shooting so psychologically devastating. The attacker did not enter an empty warehouse. He entered a living community. He entered a place where people had expectations about how their day was supposed to unfold. At Dawson, a Wednesday afternoon was supposed to have a predictable structure. Classes, lunch, conversations, movement, more classes, then the journey home. For most people, the future existed only a few hours away. Someone might have been thinking about what they would eat that evening. Someone else might have been planning to meet friends. Someone might have been worried about an upcoming assignment. Someone might have been thinking about a relationship. Someone might have been counting the minutes until the next class ended. These thoughts seem insignificant when viewed through the lens of tragedy. But that is exactly why they matter. Human beings do not live their lives as historical figures. They live them through small concerns. The deadline tomorrow. The friend who has not answered a message. The class that feels too long. The lunch that costs too much. The decision about what to do on the weekend. That is what existed inside Dawson before the shooting. An ordinary world. And then one person entered it with an entirely different purpose. The contrast could not have been greater. The students were moving toward the future. The gunman was bringing death into the present. At approximately 12:40 p.m., that collision began. But even then, the first moments were not immediately understood by everyone. A large building can hide information. Sound travels. People react. Rumors spread. One person may see something another person cannot. Someone may hear gunfire, but not know where it came from. Someone else may see students running and only understand that something is wrong. There's a strange psychological distance between hearing that something terrible has happened and actually understanding that you are inside it. That distance can last only seconds, sometimes less. A student hears a sound, looks up, sees another person moving quickly, then sees several more. Someone says something. The meaning becomes clear. Run. And suddenly the familiar college becomes unfamiliar. This transformation is central to understanding the Dawson shooting. The architecture did not change. The meaning did. A corridor that had always been a path between classrooms became a place where people feared being seen. A door that normally represented access became something that might need to remain closed. A staircase became a possible escape route. A classroom became a shelter. A cafeteria became a place of danger. The same physical objects remained in place. Only the human relationship with them changed. This is what violence does to familiar places. It creates a second memory beneath the first. Before the shooting, a person might remember a particular hallway as a place where they met a friend. After the shooting, they might remember it as the place where they hid. Before, a cafeteria might mean lunch. After, it might mean fear. Before, the sound of footsteps meant someone was approaching. After, footsteps can mean danger. That transformation can remain long after the immediate threat disappears. And this is where the story of Dawson begins to extend beyond September 13th itself. The shooting lasted only a short time. The memory did not. The immediate event was measured in minutes. The psychological aftermath will be measured in years. But before we reach the aftermath, we need to understand the city surrounding Dawson. Montreal was not unfamiliar with tragedy. In 1989, the city had experienced the École Polytechnique massacre, when 14 women were murdered by a gunman who specifically targeted female students. That event had left a deep scar on Montreal and on Canada. The memory remained part of the city's cultural and institutional consciousness. Police tactics had evolved. Emergency planning had evolved. The understanding of school shootings had evolved. But 17 years later, Montreal was confronted with another armed attacker inside an educational institution. The similarities were horrifying. The differences were equally important. Dawson was not Polytechnique. Kimveer Gill was not Mark Lepine. The victims were different. The circumstances were different. The known motivations were different. But for people who remembered 1989, another shooting at a Montreal school carried an unbearable sense of history repeating itself. And that history would influence how the Dawson response was understood. The police officers who arrived that afternoon were entering an environment shaped by lessons from previous violence. 2 officers happened to be nearby because of an unrelated matter when they became aware of the shooting. They moved toward the college. That decision was critical. By 2006, the prevailing response to an active shooter was no longer simply to establish a perimeter and wait for specialized officers. The first officers on scene were expected to confront the immediate threat. That did not make the situation safe. It made it faster, and speed mattered. Inside Dawson, every second carried uncertainty. Outside, police were trying to reduce that uncertainty. They had to locate the gunman. They had to understand the building. They had to identify where students were. They had to determine whether there were additional attackers. And they had to do all of this while knowing that people were already injured. At the same time, the medical response was beginning. Hospitals had to prepare for multiple casualties. Emergency departments were placed on heightened readiness. Doctors and nurses had to move from ordinary hospital routines into disaster response. The transition is almost impossible to appreciate unless we understand how quickly it happens. One moment, a hospital is functioning normally. The next, staff are being told that multiple victims from a shooting may be arriving. There is no opportunity to emotionally prepare. There's only preparation in the practical sense. Beds, personnel, equipment, operating rooms, blood, triage, communication. Every part of the emergency system has to move at once. Meanwhile, families were beginning to hear. That is another layer of the setting that cannot be seen from photographs of the college. The setting was not only Dawson. It was also the homes, offices, cars, hospitals, and streets where people waited for information. A parent could be miles away and still suddenly become part of the tragedy. A friend could be watching television. A sibling could hear the name of the college on the radio. Someone could receive a message from a friend saying, "I'm okay." Someone else could receive nothing. That silence could become unbearable. When a mass shooting occurs, information becomes a form of survival. People need to know who is safe. But during the first moments, information is incomplete. The numbers change. The identities are unclear. Rumors spread. News organizations report what they know, then update it. Police release limited information while the investigation continues. Hospitals protect patient privacy. Families wait. And somewhere in that confusion, the name Anastasia D'Souza would emerge. But she had not been a name that morning. She had been a person. That is an important distinction when reconstructing the setting. Anastasia was not walking into Dawson as the future victim. She was simply a young woman beginning college. The tragedy did not change who she had been. It changed how history remembered her. That is something that happens to victims in true crime stories. The crime can swallow the person. Their identity becomes connected to the moment of death. But Anastasia's life did not begin at 12:40 p.m. She had already lived 18 years. She had family. She had memories. She had interests. She had hopes. She had a future. And on September 13th, she was living that future until she wasn't. The setting therefore needs to be imagined not as a dark place waiting for violence, but as a bright and ordinary place where people had every reason to feel secure. That is what makes the intrusion so disturbing. The danger was not supposed to be there. A college is built around an assumption that people can gather without expecting someone to attack them, that students can walk through hallways without calculating escape routes, that a classroom door is simply a classroom door, that the loudest interruption will probably be an argument, a fire alarm, or someone arriving late. The shooting shattered that assumption. And once an assumption like that is broken, rebuilding it is difficult. The physical building can be reopened. The psychological building is different. It is constructed inside memory. For some students, returning to Dawson meant confronting that memory. The first time they walked through the doors again, the place could not have felt the same. The college had been cleaned. The danger was gone. The gunman was dead. The police investigation was underway. But safety is not merely the absence of an attacker. Safety is the belief that an attacker will not appear. That belief had been damaged. In the days following the shooting, Dawson became a place of mourning. Flowers appeared. Candles appeared. Messages appeared. People came to express grief and solidarity. The entrance became a temporary memorial. For a community trying to understand what had happened, these objects served a purpose. They gave grief somewhere to go. A flower could represent a life. A candle could represent remembrance. A handwritten message could say what ordinary language could not. The college would later create more permanent forms of remembrance, including a peace garden dedicated to memory and peace. But the first memorials were spontaneous. They were created by people who needed to say something. We remember. We are sorry. We are here. We have not forgotten. And then came the difficult question. Could Dawson become a school again? Not merely a building where classes were technically possible. A real school. A place where students could sit down and concentrate. A place where teachers could teach. A place where laughter could return without feeling disrespectful. A place where young people could imagine their future again. That process began remarkably quickly. Within days, the college community began preparing to return. The return itself became symbolic. Walking through the doors again was an act of reclamation. The gunman had entered the building and tried to transform its meaning. The students could answer by continuing to live. They could return to class. They could study. They could make plans. They could graduate. They could become doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, artists, parents, and whatever else they had once imagined. The tragedy had taken lives. It did not have to take every future. That distinction would become central to Dawson's recovery. But on the afternoon of September 13th, recovery was still unimaginable. The immediate world was still chaos. The gunman was still inside. Police were still moving. Students were still hiding. The wounded were still being treated. Families were still waiting. And Anastasia was still fighting for her life. That final point is important because the public memory of a tragedy often becomes cleaner than the reality. History gives us a simple sequence. Shooting. Victims. Police response. Gunmen dead. But real events are not simple. People are injured at different moments. Medical conditions change. Doctors fight to stabilize patients. Some victims survive because of rapid treatment. Others remain in critical condition. Families wait through uncertainty. The final number is not known immediately. That afternoon, there was no neat ending. There was only an unfolding emergency. And while that emergency continued, the physical college was becoming something entirely different. Police were securing areas. Investigators would eventually examine evidence. Witnesses would begin describing what they had seen. Emergency crews would document their actions. The building would become part hospital, part evacuation zone, part crime scene. And outside, the city would begin asking a question that had no easy answer. How could this happen here? Not in some distant conflict zone. Not in a place where violence was expected. Here, in Montreal, at a college, among students, in the middle of an ordinary day. That question would eventually expand. How did Gil obtain weapons? Why did he choose Dawson? When did he decide to attack? What did he tell people? What had he written? What did investigators know about him beforehand? Were there warning signs? Could anyone have recognized him? Could anything have been done differently? These questions would take investigators backward through Gil's life. But before we follow that path, there's another reason the setting matters. The physical location was not chosen at random in the sense that it was a remote or isolated target. Dawson was accessible. It was busy. It was filled with young people. It was connected to the city around it. The attack, therefore, immediately became a public event. People outside could see the police response. News organizations could reach the area. Families could arrive. Emergency services could mobilize. The tragedy unfolded not behind some distant wall, but in the visible heart of Montreal. The city watched. And as the images spread, Dawson became known to people who had never stepped inside it. For them, the college became a photograph. Police cars, students fleeing, emergency vehicles, a building surrounded by uncertainty. But for those who actually belonged there, Dawson remained more complicated. It was still their school, their classrooms, their friends, their memories, the place where they had met people, the place where they had worried about exams, the place where they had laughed, and now, the place where someone had died. That contradiction would remain for years. A place can be both beautiful and painful. It can contain good memories and terrible ones. It can represent education and loss at the same time. Dawson would have to learn to carry both. And perhaps that is why the story of the setting cannot end with the shooting. The setting continued to exist. The city continued. The college continued. Students continue growing older. New students arrived who had not been there in 2006. They would hear the story. They would see the memorial. They would learn Anastasia's name. But they would experience Dawson differently. For them, September 13th was history. For the people who were there, it was memory. That difference matters. History can be studied. Memory has to be lived with. And Dawson became a place where those two things met. A young student walking through the college years later might see a memorial and know that someone had died there. A survivor walking through the same space might remember exactly what they were doing when the shooting began. The building would look identical. The experience would not be. That is the invisible geography of trauma. It cannot be marked completely on a map. There is no sign saying, "This is where fear began." No plaque can fully explain what a person felt. No photograph can capture a precise moment when an ordinary day became a fight for survival. But the memories remain, and they all lead back to the same beginning. September 13th, 2006, a Wednesday afternoon, Dawson College, Montreal. A normal school day, until it wasn't. The setting was ready. The students were there. The classrooms were occupied. The city was moving outside. Anastasia was beginning another afternoon of her first semester, and Kim Veer-Gill was approaching. He was carrying weapons. He was carrying ammunition. And unlike everyone around him, he was not arriving simply to participate in the ordinary life of the college. Within minutes, the building would change forever. The hallways would become escape routes. The classrooms would become hiding places. The cafeteria would become the center of terror. The streets outside would fill with police and emergency vehicles. Hospitals would prepare for the wounded. Families would begin searching for answers. And one 18-year-old student would become the only person killed by the attacker. Before that happened, Dawson was simply a school. That is how it should be remembered, not as a place created by tragedy, but as a place whose ordinary life was interrupted by tragedy. And that ordinary life is what gives a tragedy its meaning. Because when we say that Anastasia was 18, we are not simply giving her age. We are describing how much life should have remained ahead of her. When we say that students were walking through Dawson that afternoon, we are not simply describing their location. We are describing people who believed they were safe. When we say that Montreal was going about its day, we are not simply describing the city. We are describing a world that had no idea it was about to change. That is the Dawson setting. A college full of beginnings. A city full of movement. A Wednesday full of ordinary plans. And an illusion of safety that would disappear in a matter of minutes. The next part of the story must therefore slow down again. Away from the building. Away from the police. Away from the killer. Toward the person whose life gives this tragedy its human center. Anastasia Desosha was 18. She was a student. She had a future. And before September 13th turned her into a name remembered in connection with violence, she was simply living her life. To understand what was taken that afternoon, we have to look at that life first. Because a tragedy is never measured only by how someone died. It is measured by everything they were before they died, and everything they would become if they had been allowed to live. Montreal did not stop on September 13th, 2006. That may be one of the strangest things about a tragedy of this kind. Inside Dawson College, the world was collapsing into confusion, fear, and survival. Outside, the city continued. Cars moved through intersections. Buses followed their routes. People went to work. Restaurant prepared lunch. Stores opened their doors. Phones rang. People laughed. People complained about traffic. Someone somewhere was probably planning dinner. Someone else was probably late for an appointment. The city had no idea that, inside one of its colleges, an ordinary Wednesday had become a life-and-death emergency. That contrast would soon become one of the defining images of the Dawson shooting. A busy city surrounding a building where time seemed to stop. Dawson College sat within that larger urban environment. It was not an isolated campus separated from Montreal by miles of empty land. It was part of the city. Students could arrive by public transportation. They could walk from nearby streets. They could leave the building and immediately become part of the wider movement of Montreal. That connection to the city gave Dawson its character. It also meant that when the shooting happened, the emergency quickly spilled beyond the walls. Police vehicles began appearing. Emergency personnel moved toward the college. People outside started asking what was happening. Students emerged from the building in groups. Some were crying. Some looked stunned. Some were trying to contact family. Others were looking around as though they could not yet believe what they had experienced. And beyond the immediate scene, Montreal began absorbing fragments of the story. There had been a shooting at Dawson. Students had been injured. A gunman was involved. Police were responding. The details were incomplete, but the name of the college was enough. For a city that remembered to call Polytechnique, the word school combined with the word shooting carried an almost physical weight. 17 years earlier, Montreal had experienced the murder of 14 women at the École Polytechnique. The memory of that massacre had never completely disappeared. It existed in memorials, in public discussions, in police training, in the stories told by families, in the annual commemorations that brought people back to the grief of 1989. Now, in 2006, another Montreal educational institution was surrounded by police. Another armed man had entered a school. Another group of students had been forced to confront violence. The circumstances were different. The ideology was different. The victims were different. But the emotional shock was immediate. Montreal had seen this before, and nobody wanted to see it again. Inside Dawson, the atmosphere could not have been further removed from the ordinary rhythm of a college. Students were no longer thinking about their next class. They were thinking about exits. They were thinking about doors. They were thinking about whether the person beside them was safe. Some people ran as soon as they realized what was happening. Others hid. Some stayed in classrooms. Some moved away from the sound of gunfire. And some were injured. The instinct to survive does not look the same in every person. One person runs. Another freezes. Another helps someone else. Another hides. Another searches for a friend. None of these reactions can be predicted perfectly. The human body responds before the mind has fully processed the danger. The sound of gunfire can trigger an immediate flood of adrenaline. The heart races. Breathing changes. Muscles tense. Attention narrows. The brain begins searching for the fastest path to safety. A student who had spent weeks learning the layout of Dawson could suddenly experience that same building as a maze. The route that usually led to class might no longer feel safe. The door that normally welcomed students might now represent exposure. A familiar staircase could become an escape route. The ordinary map of the college had been rewritten by fear. That is what happens when violence enters a familiar place. The building itself remains unchanged, but the meaning of every space can shift. A hallway is no longer just a hallway. It becomes a hallway where someone ran. A room becomes a room where someone hid. A door becomes a door someone locked. A cafeteria becomes associated with a moment when the normal world disappeared. These associations can survive for years. That is why returning to the physical location after trauma can be so difficult. The danger may be gone, but the memory remains. And memory does not always respond to logic. Someone can know intellectually that a place is safe while still feeling fear when entering it. That difference between knowing and feeling will become important for many Dawson survivors. The college could reopen. The police could declare the building secure. The gunman could be dead. But none of those facts could instantly restore the feeling of safety that existed that morning. Safety is not simply a physical condition. It is a belief. Before the shooting, students believed they could walk into Dawson without expecting to be attacked. After the shooting, that belief had been damaged. The rebuilding of that belief would take time. But on September 13th, there was no time, only the emergency. 2 Montreal police officers were nearby when the shooting began. Their proximity was accidental. They had been dealing with another matter in the area. Then the reports of gunfire reached them. They moved toward Dawson. That decision reflected the evolution of police response to active shooters. Instead of waiting outside for a specialized tactical team to arrive, officers on scene were expected to move toward the immediate threat. The reasoning was brutally simple. An active shooter does not stop simply because police have established a perimeter. Every minute can mean more victims. So the officers moved inside. Other units followed. The response expanded. The college became surrounded. But the people hiding inside did not necessarily know any of this. They did not know where the police were. They did not know whether the attacker was still moving. They did not know whether another gunman existed. They did not know whether it was safe to leave. That uncertainty was one of the most terrifying parts of the afternoon. When people later describe disasters, they often know the ending. The survivor knows the police eventually arrived. The historian knows the gunman eventually died. The viewer knows the attack will end. But the people inside the building did not have that knowledge. They were trapped inside the present. The next 30 seconds mattered more than the next 30 years. For some, the most important decision was whether to run. For others, it was whether to stay hidden. For someone else, it was whether to help a wounded person. There was no time for perfect decisions. There was only instinct. And outside the college, the emergency medical system was preparing for what could become a mass casualty event. Montreal General Hospital activated its emergency response procedures. Medical personnel prepared for incoming patients. The hospital had to shift rapidly from normal operations to crisis mode. The first patients would require immediate assessment. Who was most seriously injured? Who needed surgery? Who could wait? Who could walk? Who needed to be stabilized? The medical response to a shooting is not simply about treating wounds. It is about triage. It is about deciding under pressure how limited time and resources can save the greatest number of people. For doctors and nurses, the horror of the event is often encountered through the bodies of the victims. They may not see the crime scene. They may not know the entire story. They see the consequences. A patient arrives. Then another. Then another. Each one needs attention. Each one has a name. Each one has a family waiting somewhere. And every medical worker knows that behind every wound is a person whose life has suddenly changed. That afternoon, the city became a network of emergency responses. Police, paramedics, hospitals, fire services, college officials. The systems had to work together. But another network was forming at the same time. Families, friends, classmates, people calling one another, people searching for information, people waiting. This part of the story is almost invisible in photographs. You can photograph a police car. You can photograph an ambulance. You can photograph a college. But you cannot photograph the moment when a parent sees the name of Dawson on television and realizes their child is inside. You cannot photograph the moment when someone calls a friend and hears a trembling voice say, "I'm okay." And you cannot photograph the silence of someone who keeps calling and receives no answer. The absence of information can become its own form of terror. A person who knows their loved one is safe can begin to breathe again. A person who does not know is trapped in uncertainty. That uncertainty would continue until the victims could be identified and survivors reunited with their families. For Anastasia's family, however, the uncertainty would have a different ending. She would not return. She would become the one fatality attributed to the gunman's attack. But at the beginning of the afternoon, nobody outside Dawson knew the final number. The first reports were incomplete. Numbers changed. The media attempted to establish the scale of the attack. Some early reports described different totals for those injured. Later accounts settled on 19 injured, while institutional records have used different counting methods in describing the number of victims. This may seem like a minor technical detail. It is not. It illustrates how difficult it is to establish truth in the first hours after a disaster. Information does not arrive in a neat sequence. It arrives through fragments. A police officer reports what they saw. A hospital reports patients. A witness describes what happened. A journalist repeats information from another source. A family member provides another piece. Eventually, investigators reconstruct the sequence. But during the emergency, the story is still being assembled. That is why the first few hours can feel almost unreal. People know something terrible has happened, but they do not yet know exactly what. Dawson was becoming a national story, while the people inside were still trying to understand their own personal stories. A student might know they survived, but not whether their friend did. Another might know that a friend was wounded, but not how seriously. Another might know that someone was missing, but not why. And somewhere in that confusion was Anastasia, 18 years old, first semester, social science student in the International Business Profile, a young woman whose life had been unfolding like thousands of other young people's lives. She had plans. The precise details of those plans are not what history usually remembers. That is part of the problem. The public record tends to preserve dramatic events. It preserves the time of the shooting, the name of the attacker, the number of victims, the police response, the weapons, the investigation. But ordinary life leaves fewer records. The small conversations, the private jokes, the family routines, the hopes that never became headlines. Those things are often known only to the people who love the victim. That is why the next stage of the story has to move closer to Anastasia. Because if we only describe what happened to her, we lose the person she was. The setting of Dawson matters because it was the place where her life was unfolding. It was not simply where she died. It was where she was becoming an adult. The first weeks of college can carry a strange mixture of excitement and uncertainty. You are old enough to make more decisions for yourself, but still young enough to be learning how the adult world works. You meet people who may become lifelong friends. You discover subjects that interest you. You begin thinking about careers. You start imagining a future that is no longer abstract. That was the world Anastasia entered, and that makes the attack even more cruel. She was not near the end of a completed life. She was near the beginning. The future was still mostly unwritten. That is what makes her absence so difficult to reduce to a statistic. When we say one student killed, we can accidentally make the loss sound contained. One. But one person can contain an entire world. One person can be the center of a family. One person can be a friend whose absence changes a group forever. One person can be a future that never happens. The number one does not mean small. It means singular. There was one Anastasia. There would never be another exactly like her. And on September 13th, that singular life was taken. Outside Dawson, Montreal was beginning to gather around the story. News crews arrived. Police established control around the scene. People watched from a distance. The college became surrounded by cameras and emergency vehicles. The images were difficult to interpret if you did not know what had happened. Why were so many police cars there? Why were students being led away? Why were people crying? Why was the college closed? Then the reports became clearer. A shooting. A gunman. Multiple victims. One person dead. The gunman dead. And the name Dawson became attached to the story. For people who had never attended the college, Dawson became an image.